Some artists are born inside their time. Others seem to arrive from somewhere else, carrying a weather of their own. Grace Slick was never meant to be comfortable inside any single decade. She didn't just sing the sound of an era, she embodied its contradictions: cold and commanding, rebellious and elegant, destructive and painfully lucid. Long before her voice became a rallying cry, before her face became a symbol, she was already a woman quietly at war with the world she had been born into. She came into it in 1939 in Chicago, raised between discipline and privilege. Her father worked in finance. Her mother had once dreamed of the stage. From the beginning, Grace inherited both order and performance, but belonged fully to neither. She was educated in private schools, taught manners, posture, restraint, and learned very early that none of it fit her skin. On the surface, her path looked respectable: college, a polite future, even modeling, where she learned to turn stillness into presence. By day, she wore perfect clothes and practiced elegance. By night, something else was growing: a sharp humor, a restless mind, a quiet contempt for predictability. She wasn't searching for fame, she was searching for air. And long before the world knew her name, Grace Slick had already decided that whatever life was supposed to be, she would not live it quietly. Leaving a world is rarely dramatic. More often, it happens through a series of small refusals. For Grace, the first real rupture came not through music, but through motion. She stepped away from the neat expectations placed in front of her and walked into fashion, a strange compromise between rebellion and conformity. Modeling gave her independence, but it also gave her a front row seat to a life built entirely on surfaces. It was during this time that she married Jerry Slick, a childhood friend with a filmmaker's eye and a restless imagination. With him, life took on a different rhythm. San Francisco replaced predictability. Short films replaced polite ambition. And for the first time, Grace found herself near people who weren't afraid to invent their own rules. At first, she stayed in the background. She wrote, she observed, she learned how ideas were shaped into performances. Music wasn't yet a destination. It was a tool, a texture, a way to color other people's visions. But something in her was waiting. That moment arrived quietly in a small club, watching another band command a room with nothing but sound and nerve. It wasn't envy, it was recognition, a realization that the stage was not a place for decoration, it was a place for power. She didn't walk home that night the same person. Some doors, once seen, never close again. Courage rarely arrives fully formed. For Grace, it had to be built in public, one uncertain step at a time. She didn't step onto the stage alone. She brought her husband with her, and together with his brother, they formed a band that felt more like an experiment than a plan. They called it the Great Society, a name that already hinted at irony, at distance, at a refusal to take the world at face value. In the beginning, they were rough, imperfect, but that was the point. They weren't trying to be beautiful, they were trying to be alive. They played small rooms to small crowds and discovered that something in Grace changed the moment she sang in front of people. Her voice wasn't sweet, it wasn't comforting. It cut, it commanded, it stayed. One night, in a sudden rush of clarity, she wrote a song in less than an hour. It borrowed its imagery from childhood stories and its structure from distant rhythms, but its feeling came from somewhere far more dangerous. The song didn't sound like the time it was born into, it sounded like a warning. The band recorded. The sound was imperfect, the distribution was small, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that Grace Slick was no longer practicing presence. She had found a weapon. By the time the old world came looking for her, Grace was no longer playing at being a singer. Word travels fast in small scenes, and in San Francisco, reputation moved faster than posters. One night, the people who managed Jefferson Airplane walked into a small club expecting curiosity and walked out knowing they had just seen their future. The band had lost its singer. They needed a voice. What they found was a force. The offer came quickly, and Grace didn't pretend to hesitate. Later, she would say the band was already flying, and she simply knew she had to be on that plane. But every flight requires something to be left behind. When she walked away from the Great Society, the group didn't collapse in anger, it simply stopped breathing. Without her, the rooms emptied. The silence was honest. Everyone understood what had happened. She took 2 songs with her. No one argued. With her arrival, Jefferson Airplane changed shape. What had once been a polite, intelligent folk band began to harden, to glow, to stretch towards something stranger and more dangerous. Grace didn't adapt to the band adapted to her. She brought an image as sharp as her voice, tall boots, unblinking confidence, a gaze that seemed to judge the room before it allowed itself to be seen. She wasn't asking the audience to believe in anything, she was daring them to keep up. The album arrived like a signal fire. When Surrealistic Pillow was released in 1967, it didn't just introduce new songs, it announced a new temperature. The two pieces Grace had carried with her from her former life now sounded transformed, no longer like experiments, but like declarations. One was built on loneliness and hunger. The other unfolded like a slow, hypnotic ascent into a dream that refused to explain itself. The radio didn't know what to do with it at first. Some stations refused to play it, others played it endlessly. The audience didn't hesitate. The song spread the way rumors do, not because they were safe, but because they felt necessary. Suddenly, Jefferson Airplane was everywhere, and so was Grace Slick. On stage, she didn't perform in the old sense. She stood as if she were delivering verdicts. When she sang, the room seemed to reorganize itself around her voice. At festivals and on television, she no longer looked like a singer trying to convince people. She looked like a symbol that had learned how to speak. The summer of love crowned her without asking permission. In a white dress under open sky, she sang lines that felt less like lyrics and more like instructions for leaving reality behind. For a generation looking for new languages, she didn't offer comfort, she offered a door. And once the door was open, nothing about her life or the culture around her would ever be small again. Success didn't slow the world down, it accelerated it. By the time the next records arrived, the country itself felt like it was coming apart. Assassinations, war, streets filled with anger and sirens. The music grew heavier because the air had grown heavier. Grace's voice followed the change. It darkened, it sharpened, it stopped pretending that beauty was enough. She was no longer just singing, she was speaking for a moment that did not trust tomorrow. Television appearances turned into statements. Performances turned into confrontations. She wore irony like armor and provocation like a uniform. At the same time, the substances that had once been rare and almost ceremonial became constant. She would later say she wasn't chasing pleasure, she was chasing perception, trying to tear holes in the fabric of habit and see what was underneath. But no one can carry a generation without paying for it. Her marriage, built in a quieter, smaller life, could not survive the noise. It ended without ceremony. She found herself drawn instead to someone who lived inside the same storm. Together they planned rebellions that were half joke, half prophecy, including one that nearly carried her into the White House with a pocket full of dangerous ideas. The music grew more radical, the words more direct, but underneath the fire, something else had begun: fatigue. By the time Jefferson Airplane reached Woodstock, the movement already felt older than its own mythology. The band went on in the early morning, after a night without sleep, in front of a crowd suspended somewhere between exhaustion and hope. Grace greeted them with a line that sounded like a joke and a prophecy at the same time, and then she sang as if her voice were coming from another altitude altogether. It was a beautiful moment, and it was a farewell. After that, nothing truly held together. Not because of enemies or critics, but because the center could no longer support the weight. The revolution had become a performance. The ideals had turned into habits. Inside the band, everyone began moving in different directions, pulled by different futures. Arguments broke out over small things that were never really small: songs, money, control, space. Touring became endurance. Recording became negotiation. Grace often arrived on stage already numbed, not out of carelessness, but out of a quiet grief she couldn't yet name. She could feel that the fire which had built everything was no longer burning clean. There was no dramatic breakup, no final explosion. Jefferson Airplane simply dissolved, like a storm that has spent all its electricity. And in the silence that followed, Grace Slick realized that surviving an era was harder than creating one. If the airplane could no longer fly, then it was time to build something else. Grace and her longtime partner turned their attention to the future and called the new vessel Jefferson Starship. The name itself was a quiet admission that the old world was gone. The early records dreamed of escape, from Earth, from history, from the weight of everything that had already happened. Somewhere along the way, Grace became a mother, and her life began to orbit between responsibility and disappearance. Then came a different kind of success. The music grew cleaner, the audience grew larger, the charts finally opened their doors. For the first time, she wasn't a revolutionary figure. She was a star. The irony was sharp enough to taste. The songs were everywhere, but the meaning felt thinner. Behind the scenes, alcohol stopped being a companion and became a ruler. The fall was not sudden. It was slow, private, and exhausting. She left. She returned. She left again, each time older, each time more aware that the industry had no memory and no mercy. When the final version of the band turned into a machine built for hits, she stayed only long enough to understand that she no longer belonged there. So she walked away, quietly, without ceremony. Music had been a battlefield. She had survived it. In another life, she chose colors instead of noise, canvas instead of stages. When asked if she missed singing, she said she had already told the world everything she needed to say. Some people are born to start fires. Very few know when to step out of the light.